everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Ratliff Mandolins Weekly Production Diary. I am in between batches of mandolins and taking care of the built-up repair work that kind of gathers around the shop, and we spent all of last week on the repairs and got a lot of stuff out of here, but there's still 3 instruments right now that I haven't finished, and I'll tell you about them. One is this guitar that we rebraced the top on. The whole thing had caved in, and so we pulled the top off and took all the old braces out and cut new braces and put them in with a different bracing pattern, by the way, designed to kind of reinforce the places where the top had given up and went faulty. And somebody in last week's comments asked me about the bracing pattern that I used. Now, let me back up and say, for those of you who were kind of following the series on a weekly basis, you know that I'm also building a T-play type or a T-play sized, very unusual instrument, and it's kind of been my weekend project. And I braced this guitar much like I've braced this, we'll call it a T-play, but it's really not. But and they wanted me to explain a little bit more about the bracing pattern that I used. And I've used a very similar thing to this right here, 2 tapered braces in to mainly beef up that sunk in area, and then because the whole area around the bridge had kind of caved in as well, I put a pretty healthy bridge plate area on it as well, and then a couple of cross braces here around the sound hole to kind of keep that from caving in any further, and then some 90-degree angle braces off of these main braces here. So basically this guitar is, a few of the angles are different, but it's pretty much braced just like this thing. Now, this guitar needs to be rebound probably because the binding that come off of it is really paper thin in places, and I just don't feel like putting it back on there and having to deal with it. I think it'd be better off if we just went ahead and put new binding on it. Now, for those of you who have built guitars, you know that there's not a flat spot on a guitar, really. This is actually arched and curved. The back is actually arched and curved with a different radius, and so to get a good square binding channel here with the router cut is it's a challenge. And most folks who build guitars have a router on some sort of rise and lower fixture so that the router can come up and down and up and down, and then they'll put the guitar in a sliding tray and fix it so they can run that into the router, which will go up and down. Guitars are thicker on this end than they are on this end, and with that radius it just makes them kind of hard. Well, not being a guitar builder, I don't have a jig like that, so we're going to have to build one for this instrument, and it'll just double over, and we'll use it on this instrument to rebind this thing as well. So for the moment we're going to shelf this. Obviously, as you can see, I'm getting pretty far along on this, so it's not going to be that much longer before I'll have to go build this thing anyway, which, by the way, will feature in a video, me building that thing. And so we're going to put this one off to the side for the moment and just let her sit until we can take care of that. And this week we will concentrate on the 2 mandolins, and then whatever else is left over will be spent on the upcoming batch, which, by the way, I'm going to put this thing as number 10 in the upcoming batch. So let me discuss the other two mandolins here. This was a mandolin that I built a long time ago. This is mandolin number 83, so that was 1,100 mandolins ago. It had a truss rod failure, and I've replaced it with a newer style truss rod. And last week we got as far as gluing the fretboard on, and now the customer has asked if we can cut this Florida extension off. And this was a flat fretboard new, so we're going to put a radius in it, refret the thing, and so that's going to be like number 1 on the job jar list this week. And this 1960s model Gibson F12 is here basically just for a refret. So we're going to do that for this customer, refret this old Gibson mandolin. And like I mentioned earlier, anything other than that will be getting ready or set up, either A, to do the binding on this guitar and this T-plate, or gathering material for the next batch. So that's going to be my week right there. So come along with me. I'll carry the camera. If I get anything that seems to be interesting enough to take footage on, I'll share it with you. Okay, so we're going to refret this thing, arch the fretboard, cut the fretboard end off, and that's what we're going to do first is the fretboard end. I have a Japanese pull saw, real thin curve, and that's what we're going to use to cut this fretboard end off very carefully and gently. So That took care of that Florida extension. A little bit of stain right there to kind of blend that in, and all will be well with that. And now we're going to take a pair of cutters that I have kind of ground so that they'll fit down in between the frets and pull the frets out. Now I have all of the frets taken out. I'm going to use a couple of different blocks of wood that have the radius carved into the wood. This one here I can wrap sandpaper around different grits, and this one has 100 grit glued onto it, and we're going to take that and sand that radius in. And then I also sometimes use this scraper that I have ground this radius into this one edge, and I can use it to either scrape or just use it as a gauge to make sure that we've got everything that we want to get. But basically we're going to put the radius in this fretboard. Now I've used these sanding blocks, and I went all the way down to 2000 grit paper, so the fretboard is pretty slick. It's we're all covered up with ebony dust and all like that, and I'll need to clean the slots out and make sure they're deep enough and that we haven't sanded away any, too much to fit the fret in, and then we'll go refret the thing. Okay, so this mandolin that had to have the truss rod replaced has had the truss rod replaced, fretboard glued back on, the end of the fretboard has been cut off, it's been radius, refretted, restrung. We are all good to go, with one small exception, that there was a pretty good chunk of lacquer come off right here in this corner, and I'm going to take a paintbrush and some clear lacquer and dip that out and try to fill that in so that it doesn't look quite so bad. And from 3 feet you can't see it anyway, but if you get really close you can see it. And hopefully I'll have a few days to do that with, because the customer is going to come and pick it up, and he's in West Virginia, so I might have just enough time to get that fixed. But we are good to go. This mandolin has been structurally repaired and works quite well. Time to move on to the Gibson that I'm in the middle of refretting right now. Well, there is the old 1960s Gibson with the brand new fret job, and all of the frets are good, none of them buzz. And so we are done with that repair. It's a nice old mandolin. Okay, now that the Gibson mandolin has been refretted, and that pretty much takes care of the last of the repairs that's built up, with the exception of this guitar. And so I mentioned earlier that we're kind of holding off on this guitar until we can bind the body, rebind the body. And so I need to build something where I can bind the body. Now, I have built guitars. My son's built a couple of guitars here. And the problem with binding a guitar over and above a mandolin is that a guitar is not equal thickness. We have a guitar body here. It's a lot thicker here than it is here. So when you try to run a router on it, it actually cuts a tapered slot. So what you want to do is to cut a slot that is parallel to the sides here, not leaned at this wall, not leaned out or leaned in, and then it has to be different thicknesses. Now, this is what you're looking at here is how we did those other guitars my son built. We put a guitar body in here and then just used wedges and propped it up and measured till it was more or less level, and then we had a fixture very similar to this. Had an L-shaped table out here and a router set on it. So it bolt this to the table, keeps the router bit straight up and down, and then just move this thing around and underneath the router bit, and you more or less cut your binding channel. Now, it was aggravating and not very smooth and just all kinds of issues, but it got the job done. So, and these are actually the fixtures that we used. Now, I think I've mentioned in past videos that I'm thinking about maybe building a few guitars just because I have some wood that's backed up and something different, you know. And I have this guitar here, this repair to bind, rebind. And then I mentioned that the first one of the instruments that's going to be in this batch is this little T-play / mandola / guitar that I'm building. And this is basically going to be a guitar with a 17-inch mandola scale. And so this thing is going to need binding. This thing needs binding, and anything else that I may build in the guitar category is going to need binding. So I have decided to, instead of just limping along with ancient technology, I'm going to try to build something that's nice, that works very well and is smooth to use, so that I could use it in the future. Now, to that end, the other day I bought some hinges and some pretty nice 3/4 inch plywood, no knots, sanded both sides, 5 ply, but still some pretty nice stuff. So we're going to build, I guess what I'm beating around the bush to say is that the next job around the shop here, mainly inspired by this repair that needs to be done, we're going to build a new plate fixture that will take anything from a D model down to a TERS guitar in size, so it'll be adjustable, and rebuild or actually build a new thing that will at least do this job here. It's much smoother than that thing did. So that's what I'm going to tackle next. Well, it is now Friday afternoon, quitting time, and before I close this video off, I'm going to show you what I've worked on for the pretty much the last couple of days. Number one, I have built this jig or tray for holding guitars. It's an adjustable thing. You can do this and move these things in and out. And this one will adjust this part to move up and down. And as you can see, there are several different guitar shapes and sizes, and they will all fit in. A regular D style will fit in this jig very nicely. There you go. And also the turs and the little T-play size will fit, so should handle just about any size guitar. And you can, like I said, you can adjust the height so that you can kind of get the cutter head from the router to be perpendicular to the sides. You can just level this thing right up and it works very well. And speaking of the router, right here I have the first workings of the router holder and the height trick. This can go pretty low, pretty high, and the router will sit right in this tray right here when it's eventually built, and it stays perpendicular to the table no matter what height it is. And this is a Teflon kind of plate. It'll mount under here and ride on the guitar itself. And while that jig over there controls the height of the cut, this little cutter head right here will control the depth of the cut. It is what I use for the mandolins as well. It's just a three-bladed cutter head with a bearing on the bottom. Now it's set up right now with a bearing that's the same size as the cutter head, so it's flush trim. But you can, and I have, bought different size bearings to go on it so that the blade will overhang and cut the certain depth, you know, and then with different size bearings you can cut 3 or 4 different depths. So that's how this thing is going to work. In theory anyway, so why don't you check back with me next week on the next episode of the Ratliff Mandolins Weekly Production Diary to see if we can get this whole mess to work the way it should and get some binding on some guitars here. See you next week.